Introducing our keynote speaker, Michelle Rowland, the Shadow Minister for Communications and since 2010 member for Greenway. As many of you know, before entering Parliament, Michelle was a senior lawyer specialising in competition and regulation in the telecommunications, media and technology sectors. She served as councillor and deputy mayor of Blacktown City Council, chair of Screen New South Wales and a director of the Western Sydney Area Health Service. In 2013, Michelle was appointed Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Multiculturalism and Shadow Assistant Minister for Communications. In October 2015, she was elevated to the Shadow Cabinet, and after being re-elected at the July 2016 election, she was appointed Shadow Minister for Communications. Please welcome Michelle Rowland.
Good morning, and I too begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. To Professor Derek Wilding, President of the Australian chapter of the International Institute of Communications, thank you for having me back to address the IIC's global platform, this time to unpack the Media Reform Green Paper. To Telstra, especially Ivan Cook, for all your efforts in facilitating this event, thank you for hosting us and for your support for public policy dialogue in the portfolio. And I also want to acknowledge the expert industry panels that will follow my remarks, and I very much look forward to hearing your views and learning from your insights, preliminary as they may be at this stage in the Green Paper process. Recently, Australia's national anthem was changed. Effective from the 1st of January, the second line of Advance Australia Fair changed from "For we are young and free" to "For we are one and free." Nothing to do with the various services under the Broadcasting Services Act, free or otherwise. But this change had everything to do with our nationhood, to better reflect our country's ancient story and our First Nations peoples, and to celebrate the unity of our multicultural society. In the wake of the Christchurch terrorist atrocity, at a time when ASIO was warning of the rise of far right-wing extremism in our country, in an era where online misinformation and disinformation undermines trust, order, health and safety, and in the face of widespread economic instability, we must ensure that the instruments of nation building, democracy and culture remain strong now and into the future. Of course, the objectives of broadcast media policy and law have long been concerned with developing and reflecting a sense of Australian identity, character and cultural diversity. For decades, successive Australian governments, taxpayers and industry sectors have made significant investments in the stable, ubiquitous and free terrestrial broadcasting platform that we take for granted today. They have also made significant investments in much of the content transmitted over the airwaves of our vast landmass. And television has long attracted regulation in recognition of the influence it exerts in shaping community views. So while the Black Summer bushfires and the COVID pandemic have made us far more conscious of state and territory borders than we could ever have imagined, these crises have also underscored the importance of broadcasting in bringing the nation together. Meanwhile, over-the-top services also provide Australians with entertainment, education and information. A host of streaming, SVOD, BVOD, AVOD services, apps, websites and devices also play a role. However, while Australians may be one and free, not all Australians enjoy uniform service levels, and not all services are either free or equitably available. In the 21st century, inequality has a digital dimension. And in the land of the fair go, fairness is not self-executing. While the rollout of the National Broadband Network has been declared complete by this government, reliable broadband remains a postcode lottery, and up to 250,000 NBN households still can't even access the minimum broadband speeds required under law and the NBN Statement of Expectations. We've also seen notable issues impact the reliability of the NBN, with inadequate surge protection in the network design, resulting in customers having their modems burnt out during lightning storms. We've also seen the move towards fibre to the node reduce the resilience of the NBN to power outages, which has been particularly felt in the regions. In contrast, when Australians turn on their free-to-air TV, it just works. Uninterrupted and reliable service is what they've come to expect as the norm. So I think it is certainly fair to say that in our suburbs and in our regions, the lived experience of Australians is that terrestrial broadcasting remains the most reliable platform through which they can access both television and radio. And while some of us can afford any number of subscription services, free services are still relied on by the vast majority of Australian citizens. The pandemic has exposed a digital divide, the gap between the haves and have-nots when it comes to digital accessibility, affordability, including up to 55,000 households with school children who had no internet connection at the outset of the pandemic. So free-to-air television remains an important platform, even as it changes and itself faces challenging market conditions. The industry has long been crying out for reform, for material change and a serious conversation about its future. In the meantime, times have changed. Many young people, including my kids, don't really understand the word television. The concept of linear broadcasting is a bit strange to them. They'll ask if they can turn on ABC Kids or Netflix or YouTube, often with a particular program in mind, and seek to skip any ads. For them, TV is the thing in the lounge room on which to watch the above mentioned, not the linear content. But none of this means that free, ubiquitous linear TV isn't integral. What it does mean is that we need a smart conversation about how best to leverage the linear window as an anchor to place and community, complemented by the array of over-the-top services and connected devices. No one understands this better than the television sector, and they have been working to prepare for a dialogue on the role of linear television in Australia. These issues include complex engineering, economic and socio-political issues that require timely, sensitive and holistic consideration. And this brings me to the Media Reform Green Paper. As I've noted elsewhere, the government's 2017 changes to media law demonstrate that piecemeal tinkering, backroom deals and short-termism actually don't serve the nation very well. Contrary to the government's promises at the time, these changes have failed to usher in the so-called new era for media diversity and journalism jobs, particularly in regional areas. So I welcome any attempt by government to look beyond narrow self-interest and short-termism. I welcome a dialogue about the future. So with all due respect to the contributors to the paper and in the spirit in which the consultation intends, I offer the following policy critique, naturally with some political overlay given my role and the special role of broadcasting in the national psyche. My critique of the Green Paper is threefold. It is ill-timed, it is ill-conceived and it is inadequate. Taking each of these in turn. Firstly, the timing of the Green Paper is curious. It was released in late November 2020, well into this government's 8 year in office, halfway through the term of the 46th Parliament, almost 18 months after the ACCC delivered the final report of the Digital Platforms Inquiry, almost a year since the government committed to commencing a staged process to reform media regulation towards a platform-neutral regulatory framework in response to the ACCC inquiry, over a month after the launch of the Save Our Voices campaign by regional media, and just 1 month before the minister's so-called implementation roadmap had already run out of actions on media regulation reform. In the midst of a pandemic, during recovery after the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression, the minister lobbed a new project into the fray entitled Media Reform Green Paper, Modernising Television Regulation in Australia. What could this be, we all thought? Was it to work through the underpinning principles, concepts and objectives for a harmonised framework, maybe a new Communications Act? Was it to offer up options for structural media ownership reform in answer to regional media's Save Our Voices campaign? Was it to address the early warning signs of market failure in regional television broadcasting, words that I was stunned to read in the explanatory memorandum to the Broadcasting Services Amendment, Regional Communications Radio and Other Measures Bill last year? Finally, was the Green Paper to address the outstanding recommendations of the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry, the recommendations the government initially rejected or has failed to progress adequately? The government likes to use the ACCC report as the new line in the sand around the impetus for media reform. But the reality is the regulator warned the government the framework was under strain, replete with broken concepts a decade ago. But the answer to all these possibilities is no. A shame, given that in the past 18 months, the department has put out tenders worth over $300,000 for independent research and assessment of Australia's regional television broadcasting industry, regional broadcasting advice, and assessment of media business models and supports. The Green Paper leaves the balance of the ACCC's recommendations on the table. Instead, it cobbles together some leftover questions on SVOD regulation from the Screen Content Review, which has been dragging on since the former minister first announced it back in May 2017, with some early questions on a potential second digital dividend from the auction of the 600 MHz band, an issue commonly understood to be of medium-term focus plucked from the future for examination right now. These issues are bridged through potential changes to broadcast licensing and content regulation, and the creation of two trusts that, mirage-like, shimmer in the distance in the form of funding for local news and Australian content. It begs the question, what real-worldism has been brought to this exercise? Who did the government consult with? And who or what was the real impetus for this paper? And I say this with all sincerity, and I don't doubt they may be out there, maybe even in this room. But thus far, I'm yet to meet a stakeholder who was wanting or expecting the Minister to kick off a concerted discussion about a second digital dividend at this point in time. The ongoing soul-searching on the question of SVOD regulation really is dragging on. It is coming up to 2 years since Labor committed to make it Australian, putting the question of regulation beyond doubt, but leaving the precise mechanism to be determined by an expert-led task force. The notion of the 600 auction as soon as 2025, however, has come out of the blue and taken many by surprise. And it's a different kind of surprise, depending on your current relationship to the band in question and the business cases you might be contemplating. It has taken many aback because the ACMA's 5-year Spectrum Outlook, or FISO, a 5-year work plan for the regulator informed by industry consultation, has 600 megahertz in the category of monitoring, stating, and I quote, "Continue to monitor domestic and international developments in these bands to identify usage trends." Yet the Green Paper envisages a scenario where the planning, auction and restack work for the band is done and dusted in under the immediate next 5 years. Meanwhile, the FISO flags that WRC 23 is set to review the spectrum use and spectrum needs of existing services over the frequency band 470 to 960 megahertz in Region 1, so clearly big questions remain to be resolved. Without a doubt, the 600 has been on the radar of the mobile sector. It is certainly a band that industry is interested in, and periodically there have been general references to a potential second digital dividend. While the telcos have been focused on preparing for the upcoming 26 gigahertz auction of millimetre wave spectrum, among other things, including changes for the 3.4 gigahertz spectrum licences, the 850 megahertz expansion band, and the 900 megahertz band spectrum allocation, the Green Paper now has brought the 600 megahertz rare, scarce, low-band spectrum into focus and rocketed it up the list of considerations for mobile network operators. The future and implications of the 600 megahertz band in the ecosystem are huge, and planning for a change in use of a spectrum band is a complex task. Little wonder that the government has extended the deadline for submissions on the paper by a couple of months. Now, I'll be very interested to see the detailed submissions when industry is in a position to share them, including on how realistic the indicative timetable is in view of international developments, pricing analysis, and consumer impact. So while domestic and international processes play out, I'm just going to call this how I see it. And forgive my scepticism, but the Green Paper did at first glance appear to be designed to distract and deflect, divert and delay. Perhaps it was designed to make Liberal National Party members, including backbenchers, think that on this issue the Minister has the portfolio in hand, while giving them all something to say to the media stakeholders and screen sector producers who come knocking on their doors. The paper does put forward what it calls a mutually beneficial solution, namely reform proposals that could reduce the regulatory burden for television broadcasters, free up the spectrum for telcos and 5G, which of course we are all enthusiastically awaiting, unlock funds to dole out for local news and Australian content production, all while returning funds to government coffers. It sounds pretty good, but what is the counterfactual? Put another way, this could force the broadcasters into spectrum that limits their ability to compete, flog off a scarce and valuable public resource, reduce broadcast channel offerings, permit a reduction in the amount of Australian content available in regional, fund television's competitors with funds from the spectrum auction, potentially force the ABC and SBS channels to share a multiplex, break contracts and drop a channel, squeeze community TV out for good, all while removing public interest safeguards for Australian content and returning funds to consolidated revenue. But in all seriousness, in order to achieve the proposals in the Green Paper, a few fundamental questions need to be answered. What does it mean for the future competitiveness of broadcast television, the equality of service provision between city and the bush, and taxpayer access to taxpayer-funded broadcasting services and Australian content? I'll return to these issues in a moment and some of my concerns about the underlying assumptions. It is one thing for the government to put out a green paper talking about trusts for local news and screen production in 2025. But let's remember the government's actions in 2020 were to suspend and then water down or effectively abolish regulatory safeguards for children's television production. And the government's allocation of the Public Interest News Gathering Fund, announced as a COVID response measure, left small and independent publishers with less than they were originally promised in 2017. Take also the current parliamentary inquiry into Australia's creative and cultural industries and institutions. The Minister announced this inquiry in August last year, a year after I gave a speech to this forum on the topic of Australia's creative economy. I'm pleased to see the government finally pick up on some of the potential of the creative industries and note that one of the terms of reference is to inquire into the impact of the pandemic. But I am sceptical of what the inquiry is designed to achieve, beyond getting creative industry stakeholders off the minister's back, since the government removed arts from the title of the department and denied many freelance and independent creative workers JobKeeper after their livelihoods were shut down almost overnight during lockdown. Meanwhile, the inquiry doesn't report until October, possibly around the time of the next election, a very leisurely timeframe given the scale of the pandemic that may be designed to run dead as an exercise in distraction and deflection. The distorting impact of some of the government's decisions, design failures and lack of transparency are of real concern, and the gap between rhetoric and reality does not engender trust. My point is the second digital dividend is about more than just a series of regulatory and business transactions. Linear broadcasting has intrinsic value. What is at stake is the role and future of television in our society now and into the future, as well as safeguarding of national and cultural identity during this tumultuous time. Turning to the second of my critiques, the Green Paper is somewhat misconceived and founded on questionable assumptions in some places. Mindful that this may be intended as a device to stimulate debate, I offer some observations. The title says Modernising Television Regulation, but the paper does seem more concerned with identifying a pathway towards realising the second digital dividend than a genuine discussion about the future of television or modernising television regulation in a multi-platform environment. Were it genuinely about the sustainable future of television, it would at least discuss the hybrid interplay and regulation of linear services with related over-the-top services and connected devices. It would offer a view on the competitive future of television in Australia and grapple with the implications of confining television broadcasting to a new home in the spectrum that stifles 4K service provision, amongst other things. It would not offer a vision for less channels. It would not assume competition to be a problem per se, and it would not immediately assume certain efficiency benefits of MPEG-4 or necessarily assume that television no longer needs so much spectrum as the Green Paper does. Pick up an Aldi catalogue these days, and I know you all do. Look at the special buys, and you'll see that Australian consumers already expect 4K TV. What does it mean for advertisers and audiences if our television industry can't deliver 4K over linear? Talk to a blind or vision impaired Australian and see if they are satisfied, for example, with the level of audio description on free-to-air television, or that their human rights are being met compared to what's available on Netflix. Now, on this point, Labor welcomes the fact that the Minister adopted Labor's policy of funding the ABC and SBS to commence provision of audio description, but there's a lot more to do. 21 years ago, the final report of the Productivity Commission inquiry into broadcasting noted the impact of internet services on competition in Australian media. Internet-based competition isn't new, and the industry doesn't shy away from it either, regarding competition as par for the course while focusing their concerns on regulatory asymmetry and levelling the playing field. The point is they want to compete. A few years ago, at an address to the SMPTE conference in 2017, I flagged the advent of 4K and 8K TV and called for public dialogue on broadcast standards evolution. I put a series of questions to the government in that speech, asking, what should government be doing to support the future evolution of digital terrestrial television to enable it to compete with over-the-top providers in the broadband-enabled environment? In recent times, the Australian television industry has been making progress on these issues, running trials, meetings and exploring options. I understand numerous work streams exist to test what may be possible. Again, and on the other hand, were this a genuine discussion about the second digital dividend, it will grapple with analysis of timing, international developments, pricing, guard band interference, and consumer disruption issues and the like. Another misconception threaded through the Green Paper is that people in regional Australia will or should accept less channels and or less Australian content. There is something opportunistic about exploiting any current weaknesses of regional broadcasters. Dangling the promise of a tax-free licence and fewer regulatory obligations around Australian content to move them along and out of the 600 MHz range, potentially triggering the shift of the entire television sector, all while ignoring their broader calls for reform, is certainly one way of clearing the band. But the idea of giving free-to-air television businesses a choice about their service and regulatory obligations could mean some Australians miss out quite unevenly as a result. The Green Paper envisages a situation where there will be fewer linear television channels and less Australian content in the bush than in the cities, given the proposal that the new licence, and I quote, would offer a pathway to deregulation, including, and I quote, no obligation to meet an Australian content requirement on their multi-channels. These proposals have implications for the entire screen ecosystem, impacting as it does audiences, advertising revenues, affiliate deal costs and revenue, and commissions for screen producers and jobs in the screen sector. Pitched as the maintenance of service levels at close to current levels on the face of it, the Green Paper leaves open the situation where the ABC and SBS may be directed to share a multiplex and reduce their channel offering. Now, would we care to know which channel the Minister thinks should go? Should it be NITV, ABC Kids or ABC News? Where does the Green Paper leave the concept of equalisation? Has the department done any modelling on what regional media should look like outside the prism of ownership and control? And to return to my earlier theme, where are the nationals? Let's not forget, this is the same minister who saw fit to let the ABC TV signal in East Goulburn and the SBS TV signal in Bermagui be lost to residents for months last year during a pandemic, while he ran late working out who should pay to get them running again. The same who responded to the ACCC's finding that the public broadcasters are not currently resourced to fully compensate for the decline in local reporting and that they should have stable and adequate funding by then proceeding with further cuts to the ABC. Now, Labor is proud to have led calls to include the public broadcasters in the News Media Bargaining Code, which passed Parliament last week, which incidentally was left out of the draft version. We noted that there should be a return on taxpayer investment in news from the digital platforms and that both the ABC and SBS have long been permitted to derive commercial revenue. And while the Ping Trust and the Create Australian Screen Trust should be debated constructively, I will say this. This government has zero credibility on grants administration, and it's not just because of sports rorts or because Ping and Cast are still years away at best. When the Ping was announced last year as a COVID relief measure, it sounded like $50 million had been found. The reality is that $36 million of it was re-announced from a 2017 fund that was majority underspent. The Ping criteria was problematic, and the minister's involvement in both its design and allocation served to undermine press freedom. And there is yet to be any clear evidence or support to small and regional publishers about how to register with the ACMA, contact the digital platforms, or access a copy of the standard offer from Google and Facebook. Meanwhile, other trust options should be explored, including to support improved regional connectivity as well as improving accessibility of content with both improved active monitoring of captioning quality by the regulator and more funding for additional hours of audio described content. The last element of my critique is that the Green Paper is inadequate. While it looks out to an earlier than anticipated second digital dividend, other more immediate and pressing issues don't get a look in. For a paper ostensibly about modernising television regulation, there is precious little television regulation under examination. It has been deeply disappointing to see the sunsetting provisions of the Legislative Instruments Act overtake the government as the driving imperative for the examination of key media policy issues. In 2019, the imminent expiration of the Alston determination saw the minister kick the can down the road on the question of whether live stream TV and radio services delivered over the internet should be regulated under the BSA. In 2020, the expiration of the parental lock standard saw the ACMA explore what other incentives or regulatory techniques could be used instead of or in addition to those currently contained within the parental lock standard, enlivening important questions around domestic reception equipment, EPGs and domestic reception labelling schemes. This government likes to talk a big game about regulating big tech and digital giants. But the reality is that connected smart TVs, as are television device manufacturers and software providers, are challenging our free-to-air broadcasters today, with control of the television interface where prominence is for sale. App updates are outside the control of the broadcaster, and advertising revenue share deals are increasingly onerous. Now, it's well and good that the Green Paper mentions a requirement on certain SVOD and AVOD businesses to make Australian content discoverable to Australian audiences, but it is light on detail and falls short of mandated prominence requirements across the board. Now, in 2021, the anti-siphoning list is set to expire. My passion for Australian TV and content is not confined to drama and news. It includes sport. And for anyone who enjoys watching Meg Lanning play cricket, the lines between art and sport can at times be blurred. Sport on our TV screens is hugely significant for the Australian way of life for millions of our fellow citizens. But these cultural touchstones being broadcast for free across our vast continent are not guaranteed. The anti-siphoning list holds an important place in the Australian broadcasting landscape because it should be a guardrail ensuring free-to-air broadcasters, and thus Australians, have access to significant sporting moments. Imagine Cathy Freeman's Sydney Olympics behind a paywall, or John Aloisi's winning penalty against Uruguay, sending Australia to a World Cup being confined to pay-per-view. Or, of course, if the Parramatta Eels' inevitable 2021 Grand Final victory was only broadcast on Fox or Kayo. These are culturally significant events for the vast majority of Australians, and they should be accessible to all Australians. And not only is it important for the Australian people and nation building, but also important for the development of the sports themselves. While there are legitimate debates to be had about the framework in 2021, my message is that the principles of accessibility and inclusiveness are important. The implications of its future in a fragmented media environment are real. But with the anti-siphoning list set to expire on the 1st of April, less than 5 weeks away, we have no guarantee from this government about its future. The last time the government updated the anti-siphoning list, Australians lost free access to a number of matches of cricket, netball, rugby union and rugby league test matches, Socceroos and Matildas, World Cup qualifiers played outside Australia, the Australian Open and Masters Golf and more. And given this government has put women's and niche sports behind a paywall with a grant of $40 million to Fox Sports, Australians have every right to be concerned about the future of sport on free TV. Now, I do acknowledge the role of subscription services like Foxtel and Kayo in the ecosystem, and I commend them on their efforts during what's been really difficult circumstances. But I also have a desire to see contestability and accessibility where taxpayer funds are involved. So in conclusion, the Green Paper puts forward some proposals for which I'm sure many in this room will constructively engage. Labor is up for a mature discussion about these issues and will continue to engage constructively. But the thought I want to leave you with is that media and communications policy has real-world implications for real people. On Friday afternoon, at the end of a long sitting fortnight, I was privileged to officiate at the opening of a beautiful new cricket pavilion in Pearce Reserve in the suburb of Kings Langley in my electorate of Greenway. It was the latest milestone in local sporting amenities in the precinct. All 3 levels of government contributed to its realisation. Asked to say a few words, I actually mentioned in my remarks that I was giving this speech today, and I wanted to recognise the importance of grassroots sport and the accessibility of enjoyment. I didn't expect to have so many members of the cricket club lining up afterwards to tell me how real those comments were and how much they resonated with them. Being blocked behind a paywall is very real. Not seeing a diversity of sports or your local heroes on TV is real, just as not being able to afford an array of streaming subscriptions has very real consequences. Not being able to see local sports teams on community TV is real. So I understand the importance of joined-up policy when it comes to driving outcomes across my local community as well as the nation through the communications portfolio. It reinforces that communications policy permeates our own lives as well as the national conversation. As promising as the benefits of 5G are and how enthusiastically we are all awaiting it, television occupies a special place. We need joined-up policy development and consultation to deliver on the accessibility and inclusion that I've described, as well as diversity and competition as I've described, in media and communications, in the interest of not only those kids playing cricket at Pearce Reserve in Kings Langley, but for all the citizens of our great nation. Thank you.
Michelle, it won't come as a surprise to many people here that you can offer such a thoughtful presentation that ranges across such a diverse range of topics such as spectrum, Australian content, news, customer devices, screen production. So thank you very much for your time this morning.